So can you guys hear me? Just can someone say hi?
Hello.
Okay, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Today we'll talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is perhaps the most important of the macro chapters. It develops the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Um, This model is widely used by many economists, policymakers, journalists, and business people. So if you are able to understand this model, I think you will able to understand how the world works, and then also the following chapters will study. It will be easier to learn. Most students find this to be one of the most challenging chapter in the textbook. However, much of the material here already we study in different previous chapter. For example, the classical dichotomy, the relationship between investment and interest rates, the relationship between net exports and the exchange rate. So this chapter brings everything together in a different context to address your most important questions in, you can think, in economics. What causes recessions? What can policymakers do to alleviate recessions? Okay. So in this chapter, what we are going to learn, what are economic fluctuations, what are their characteristics, how does the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply explain economic fluctuation, why does aggregate demand curve slopes downward, and what shifts the aggregate demand curve, what is the slope of aggregate supply curve in the short run and in the long run, what shifts the aggregate supply curve, short run and long run supply curve. There are 5 main sections introduced in this chapter. The first one, 3 key facts about economic fluctuation. Explaining short-run economic fluctuations, aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve, 2 causes of economic fluctuations. So, real GDP over long run in the United States grows about 3% per year on average. And GDP in the short run fluctuates around its trend. So if I want to see that here, that suppose here you have a time and here you have your real GDP. Then the over time could be like this. So this is your average GDP, real GDP over time. But in the short run, could be something like this. Okay. So this is your fluctuates around its trend. So it could be higher than average trend, sometimes it would be lower than the average trend. Okay, so the recessions, the period of falling your real incomes and rising unemployment, if it is moderate, but if it is severe, then we call that depressions. It's very rare. You can see this one. You guys maybe know, and we also talked about these 2008 and 9, the great recessions. On that recessions, I think GDP fell around 4%. From the fourth quarter of 2007 to the second quarter of 2009. And unemployment increases from 4.4% in May 2007 to your 10% in October 2009. Okay, the 10% unemployment rate was the highest in more than a quarter century. Okay, so let's see the GDP fluctuations for US economy. Then three facts about economic fluctuation. The fact one, economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Okay, so here is the graph for real gross domestic product from 1969 to 2019. And as you know, we see it before, if you click on this page, you can see the graph, the real graph on these Fred websites. Then you can edit and change if you want to do it again. So if you need it, you can do that. So here, this shaded bar shows your recession. So these are the recessions. Okay, and you have you have a different durations, and this is not occur your regularly. So it's irregular pattern here. So you can see here, this is 1980 recessions, where you have another one is 1982. I think, yes, 1982. And then if you see the expansion over here, which is, I think, the more expansion of it could be over here, that is from 2001 to 2019. Okay, so you don't have any regular pattern, and also it's very unpredictable. You can't predict when you will have recessions. The second fact, most macroeconomic quantities fluctuate together. This is about real gross private domestic investment, the same period. Again, you can see whenever you have a recessions, you see your investment is going down. Same as in our PBS diagram, it's not easy to see, but whenever you have a recessions, you see that gross domestic product also going down. Okay, so here this is not only for investment or GDP. This is true of other variables as well. So when the economy is in recessions, income fall, consumer spending falls, profit fall, many stock market prices fall, tax revenue falls, causing budget deficit to rise, and spending on imports falls, causing trade deficit to shrink. But these variable fluctuates by different amounts. Even though the investment averages about 1/6 of your GDP, we know this. The declines in investment account about 2/3 of the decline in GDP during recessions. So different variables have a different magnitude. So even though they have the similar pattern, but the magnitude will be different. Our last third fact, as output falls, your unemployment rises. You can see whenever you have a recessions, I'm using other graph, recessions, you see unemployment rises. So during each recession, the unemployment rate rises, which you see it here. When firms cut back on production, they do not need as many workers. Similarly, during expansions, we see that unemployment, you can see it here, falling. As firms increase their output, they need more workers. Okay. So, can you guys answer this one? And go to this website, and then if you know it, how to do it. So just when the economy goes into a recessions, real GDP and unemployment rate. So what would be the answer here? So correct answer is C. Okay. So when the economy goes into recession, real GDP falls and unemployment rises. Very simple. We studied classical economics last few chapters. So the assumption of your classical economics, the first one is classical dichotomy. The assumption is here that we need to analyze or study separately real and nominal variables. We know what is real variables. It is quantities, that utility prices, real GDP. Nominal is measured in terms of money, the nominal GDP. Okay. The net rate of money is saying the changes in money supply affects nominal but not real variables. Now, question is, do these assumptions of classical macroeconomic theory apply to the real world in which we live? So the reality of your short-term fluctuations, that is, most economists believe that classical theory describes the world in the long run, but not in the short run. So in the short run, changes in nominal variables like money supply or P can affect real variables like Y or the unemployment rate. And we'll use here a new model which is aggregate demand and aggregate supply. To explaining that if you change any nominal variable, it could affect the real variable, which is not in the case we saw in our last few chapters or your classical models. So do this one again. So the correct answer is A. The most economists believe that classical macroeconomic theory is valid only in the long run. Okay. So as I said, that we want to develop a new model or study a new model, the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay. So our model of short-term economic fluctuation focuses on the behavior of two variables. The first variable is the economy's output of goods and services as measured by real GDP, which is we are showing here Y on this x-axis. And the second is the average level of prices as measured by the CPI or the GDP deflator, which is P here. Okay, so this is your price level, and here you have a real GDP or the quantity of output. And then you have a aggregate demand curve, which is downward sloping. And you have a short-run aggregate supply curve, which is upward sloping. And then from here, we can get this model determines the equilibrium price and equilibrium output. Okay. So this model is similar to our model we study in chapter 4, demand and supply. The difference is there we just identify or determine the price for a specific good, like demand for ice cream, demand for pizza. But here we include all the goods in all markets. Okay, here is the price level for all the goods. Okay, so here not in a specific goods demand or supply. Okay, so before we start, so when we think about your aggregate demand, you always think about this equation. It will help you to understand the concepts. So this is y equals to c plus I plus z and x. And when we talk about your supply curve, not short run and long run, always remember our production function. There are some other variables we should include here, but for time being, you just use this production function. So supply curve with production function, whereas demand curve with this y equals to c plus I plus z plus nx. Use this. Okay, and we'll go through in detail all these things. So what about this chapter? This chapter will talk about why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, this one, and when it could shift right or left, and why the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, the long run I'll talk about later, and when it could shift right or left. Okay, so these are the concepts we learn in this chapter. So the first talk about the aggregate demand curve. Here, so the aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of all goods and services demanded in the economy at any given price level. Okay, so why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward? What does it mean? Why does a change in the price level move the quantity of goods and services demanded in the opposite direction? So if you see this graph here, that when the price is P1, the your Y is the real GDP is Y1. When price level increases is P2, then Y is going down. Sorry. So you can see this here. So now the question is how we can explain this opposite relationship. Again, as I said, that we will use this equation that y equals to your c plus I plus z plus nx. We assume z is fixed by government policy. To understand the slope of AD must determine how a change in P, that price level, affects C, I, and nx. Try to understand this one, then you'll see how it works. The first one, your relationship between P and C here. So this is we call the wealth effect. Let's see what is wealth effect here. Suppose the price level, that is P, declines, increase the real value of money. Like if price declines, whatever money you have in your pocket, you can buy more goods and services, as you know before we discussed this. So what is this? Means that the consumer now have more wealth. If you have more wealth, you will increase your consumption spending. But we are assuming your real income unchanged, so we don't change, we're assuming that here. So if your consumption increases, if you remember our equation, y equals to c plus I plus z plus nx, this is fixed. If your price declines due to your wealth effect, your c will go up. Ultimately, y will go up. Okay, and this is also opposite case is also true if price decreases, price increases. This is one. The next one, there is association between price and investment, which is we are saying here interest rate effect. Again, suppose the price level declines, then buying goods and services require fewer dollars. That is, if price declines, whatever you are supposed to buy or want to buy, you need less money now. Okay, so then what you will do with this extra money you have now? You will buy bonds and other assets, and ultimately it will decrease in the interest rate. So maybe it's very difficult for you to understand these concepts. Buying bonds and other assets decrease interest rates. I will explain that in next chapter. So just think that, okay, if buying bonds and other assets could decrease your interest rates. So if you decrease in your interest rate, what will happen? If you are a farm owner, maybe you will invest more, or if you are a household, if you want to buy a house, maybe you will buy a new house. So increase spending on investment. Again, the same equation we will explain that y equals to c plus I plus z, which is fixed, we are assuming, and x. So it will increase I, ultimately it will increase y. Okay, so the next one here, exchange rate effect, which is association between P and net exports. Again, for this one, I think we can use the concepts we learned in our last chapter. We can use that here. So this is your NCU, remember? So this is your NCU and then interest rate, and this is your real exchange rate, your dollar. And if this is the interest rate and this is your supply in this foreign exchange market, this is your demand, and this is your real exchange rate. And then if interest rate is, so this is the initial interest rate, then this is your new interest rate is going down, and then it shifts your supply curve, ultimately your, so you can see your exchange rate, you depreciate. Okay, so this is we learned in our last chapter. So yeah, so if real exchange rate depreciate, what does it mean? It means your goods and services in US is cheaper than your foreign countries. So ultimately your net exports will increase. If net exports increase, again the same equation we used before, C plus I plus G plus NX. So this will increase, and then ultimately it will increase here. So this is your exchange rate effect, and other effects we explained, interest rate effects, and this is coming from your wealth effects. Okay, you can see that why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping because of this wealth effect, interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. So this is example we gave you with your price decline. If it is price increase, you have the same thing. That is, an increase in P reduce the quantity of goods and service demanded because of your wealth effect. Okay, and then interest rate effect and exchange rate effect. But keep in mind here, this red arrow is not equal to fall in C, but rather the fall in demand due to fall in C. So do not confuse with this. This is not a fall in C. This is fall of your aggregate demand due to fall in C. You will see, I will explain later chapter on this thing. But make sure don't confuse here, that is change of your C. Change of your aggregate demand change due to change of your C. Okay. So what I'm trying to explain here, that demand curve is downward sloping because of your wealth effect, the interest rate effects, and exchange rate effects. Okay. Now let's move on the next concepts, which is shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay. So you should keep in mind a change in P won't shift your aggregate demand curve, but will causes a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Okay. For example, you can think about here that a stock market boom makes household feel wealthier. So in that case, they have more wealth, the consumption will increase, and ultimately aggregate demand curve shift to the right. So what you can think, again, as I said, when you study aggregate demand curve, always keep in mind that equation y equals to C plus I plus Z plus NX. We know the definition, all this, that is what is C, what is I, Z, and NX. Any event that changes your C, I, Z, or NX will shift your aggregate demand curve. So if you do not remember or understand the definition of your C, I, Z, and NX, so this is the time to read again all these definitions and how we measure all those. Okay. Okay, so here you need to remember here that except the price change. If you change the price, actually you will move along the aggregate demand curve, not shift. Except price change, whatever event you have that change your C, I, Z, and NX, that will shift of your aggregate demand curve. So few examples maybe we can see here. The changes in C could be because of stock market boom and crash, we just explained. The preferences of your consumption saving paid off. tax hikes or cuts. Changes in investment could be due to firm buy new computers, equipment, factories. Expectations, optimism and pessimisms. If you think that there will be higher demand or economy will recover from a recessions, then people will produce more, they will invest more. Again, interest rates, we know it, the monetary policy we discussed before. Investment tax credit, other tax incentives, we talked about this before, that how it could change your investment. Changes in G, like federal spending, for example, defense expenditure, increase or decrease, that could affect on your G. State and local spending, like roads and schools, that could shift of your aggregate demand curve. Changes in net exports, booms and recessions in countries that buy our exports. If some recessions, if you have a recessions in Europe or in Asia or some other countries, that could affect US net exports. Appreciation and depreciation resulting from international speculation in foreign exchange market, that could affect on your net exports of your US. So you see that you can list lot of factors which could affect either of these components, and make sure you understand those components, then you can easily explain if anything happened in an economy or anywhere in the world, how it could affect in US economy using this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Okay, so let's do this activity. So take a screenshot and or take a picture, and we'll solve the problem in next slide. So what happens to aggregate demand curve in each of these following scenario? Okay, so you know why an aggregate demand curve, why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, why it could shift or right or left. Okay, I explain the components as well as I explain why it's downward sloping. So here you have some examples. So tell me what will happen on aggregate demand curve because of these scenarios. Okay, solve it here. So for your code, you can check your Zoom chat, you'll find the code. So make sure you understand the concepts here. So we explained why aggregate demand curve downward sloping and what are the reasons for that, and we explained when it could shift aggregate demand, but what are the components when it could shift. So here in this exercise, what you need to do, whether your aggregate demand curve will shift right or left, or it will move along the demand curve. And also, I think you can think about how it could affect, what component it will affect on C, I, Z, or NX. If you can identify that which component it will affect, that would be easier, whether you are doing right or wrong way, because um, if you can specify that first, that whatever event you have, whether it will affect C, I, Z, or NX, then you can think whether it will increase or decrease and what direction it will go. So let me explain. So the answers here, so the first one, a 10-year-old investment tax credit expires. So here you don't have any investment tax credit. So in that case, your investment falls, the aggregate demand curve shifts left. US exchange rate falls, we just explained that now if US goods are cheaper compared to other countries, so in that case net exports will rises, and then your aggregate demand curve shifts right. And then the third one, a fall in prices increase the real value of consumer wealth. So it's kind of wealth effect. So we know that wealth effect, because of that, is moved down along your aggregate demand curve. So whatever price changes, we know its movement along the demand curve. The last one is your state government replace their sales taxes with new taxes on interest, dividends, and capital gains. So here people will have higher consumption. So then aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. So if you understand this exercise, I think you will able to understand why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, why it could shift. So make sure you read the chapter, understand the concepts clearly. Otherwise, why now we will do some kind of experiment or kind of analysis, then you're not able to understand with this model how it goes or which direction your aggregate demand curve or supply curve will shift. So let's draw type what we discussed today. So what we learn here. So what we learned? We learned 3 facts about the fluctuations, and then we learned that to explain the short-term economic fluctuations, we can't use the classical model, classical macroeconomic model. So we use here aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to explain the short-term fluctuation, which most economists do. And then we try to understand why aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, which we explain wealth effect, interest rate effect, and exchange rate effect. And then finally, we studied when aggregate demand curve will shift right or left, and we did one exercise. So in our next class, we'll study the why aggregate supply curve upward sloping, short run one, and why aggregate supply curve vertical for long run one, and when it could shift right or left. So we'll study about the supply curve in our next class. Please make sure read the chapter before coming to our next class. Thank you.
Excuse me?
Yes.
I have a super quick question about that last example problem. I think it was problem D. So the aggregate demand curve is made up of both investment and consumption. So in D, wouldn't it have to say the same because it said that the sales tax was moved over to interest rates and stuff for investment. So while consumption would have increased, investment would have decreased. So
What is investment?
investment is like putting into houses, building businesses, long-term things,
But
right?
here you taxes on interest, dividends, and capital. These are not investment. These are
That's fair. Gotcha.
so this is kind of your assets or savings, we call it.
Brain. Thank you. That helps.
Okay, good.
I had a question too, Professor.
Yes.
Am I going to be able to make up the stuff that I missed since Thursday?
Well, yeah. So just send me a reminder and I will add it. But you should
Like
tell
any-
me beforehand that you have some problem, and you should send me an email that.
Okay, yeah, it's just that I forgot my computer.
Yeah,
when I
but
went
I'm
home.
saying since you are there, you can send me an email that look, I have this problem. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So okay, send me an email. Then I think I'll add it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.